Hello, students. Welcome to Chapter 2 in our class on neurobiology. So today we're going to be talking a lot about the brain. So as we talk about the brain, one thing that I do want to get across, especially this early in class, is that this is probably the first time you've gone through all of this anatomy. So it can be overwhelming. There's a lot of detail. By the end of the class, I hope you're pretty familiar with things, that you can name a few areas, the structures, the functions, like what are next to them by the end of the class. So by the end of this week, by the end of this class period, I don't expect you to have it all 100% memorized. A lot of this lecture is kind of just repeat of what is in the book. So hopefully you've read the chapter, now you're getting it in lecture, and then you can go back and review your notes. I've also got some fun like songs and mnemonics to help you remember these things. But again, if by the end of the week you feel like you only remember 10% of the specific areas of the brain, that is okay. So reread the chapter. You don't have to memorize everything as well. The major areas you'll start to realize as we go along, some of the main areas that we talk about frequently. So refer back to the slides, refer back to this chapter, put some of these songs on your YouTube playlist if you want to review them, that kind of thing. But try not to be overwhelmed. I know it is a lot of information. So here is a list of all the videos that we're going to go through during the course of today in this lecture. I mainly put them here so you can have them all in one place if you want to find them. And also, just in case any of these give me a copyright strike, I'll remove that video. So it's possible none of these will actually appear in the video you're about to watch, or 3 of the 5, that kind of thing. So anyone that's missed, feel free to go straight to it through this link to review some of these things. These first 2 that I'm going to watch first are probably, I think, some of the better ones. So if you want to watch those 2, but again, a main thing to do is try and figure out ways to remember these on your own. Try to think of memory tricks. I think last time in class, chapter 1, I talked about how I often get hippocampus and hypothalamus mixed up because they kind of sound the same. So I thought of a way to remember this. So this is the way I'm going to remember this. So elephants, come to find out, actually have a really bad memory. Instead, it's hippos that have really good memories. So the hippocampus is named kind of like a hippo. And so hippos have good memories. That is how I'm going to remember that the hippocampus is all about memory. So in reality, I have 0 idea if elephants or hippos have good memories. This is just my little memory trick to try and remember it. Also, in addition to that, hippos are pretty scary creatures. But yeah, I will hopefully remember the hippocampus, and hippos are really involved in memory. So that kind of thing. Make your own rhymes, make your own images, maps, things like that. So with that, let's get to our first video and then get into some review over the chapter. This one, again, is probably the one that I think is the best of all of them. And then the second one is probably the second best. And then after that, I just kind of clustered them all. So these first 2 are probably the best ones to review.
The central nervous system with the brain and spinal cord, yo. The brain's in the neurocranium, the spinal cord is below. Directions are superior, inferior, dorsal and ventral, anterior, posterior, lateral, medial, caudal, rostral. We examine the brain in sections, coronal, sagittal, as well as transverse, which is also called horizontal. The brain has 5 divisions for localization, and there are important structures at each and every station. The telencephalon, diencephalon, midbrain, mesencephalon, pons and cerebellum in the medencephalon, medulla in the myelencephalon. Next we will cover 3 key regions of the brainstem, cerebellum, and the cerebrum work together to keep you sane. The brainstem includes the pons medulla midbrain, which involuntary response sustain. The cerebellum helps with balance and coordination. Its nickname is the little brain, which needs no explanation. The cerebrum has two hemispheres, each of which contains four lobes. The hemispheres exchange signals with contralateral lobodes. Note that the left hemisphere lets you understand language. Broca's and Wernicke's areas give this advantage. The four lobes are the frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital. Movement and problem solving are managed by the frontal lobe. The occipital processes vision, the parietal does touch, the temporal lobe does hearing, memory, language, oh so much. The outside of the brain is all wrinkled with convolutions, ridges, gyri, while grooves are called the sulci. Give brain surface area contributions. Deep furrows are called fissures, and there are the transverse and the lateral, the central sulcus, and the largest one, the longitudinal. Besides the skull, the brain has other strong protection, with meninges as a barrier, and CSF is for shock absorption. The dura mater, arachnoid pia mater are meninges. The pia hugs the brain, the dura's on the fringes. Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF for brief, provides the central nervous system with nutrients as well as cushioning relief. It's produced by choroid plexus in ventricles of the brain, and is absorbed in arachnoid granulation so waste can drain. The falx cerebri is found between the hemispheres, which is where the dura dips. Before the tentorium cerebelli, through the tentorial notch the brainstem slips. Four ventricles contain CSF, the fourth, third, and lateral ones in between through the cerebral. Aqueduct and intraventricular foramen, the cerebrospinal fluid runs. Neurons are the brain's units, back to the essentials. The cell bodies decide whether or not axons fire action potentials. Axons form white matter and are often myelinated, hey, while cell bodies form gray matter and messages relay.
So hopefully that one works. I think it's probably the best one. It does go into a little more detail than I hope you memorize overall, the major areas of the brains. It definitely doesn't go into all of the limbic system areas. So some of the divisions and whatnot, I don't expect you to memorize. And it doesn't go into all the limbic system areas as detailed as I would have liked. But it's a pretty good overall. It's got a catchy song, so hopefully it helps you remember. That's the main point of it. So finding things like that, using memory tools, making connections, writing down in your notes examples or things like that, those are going to be some of the best things to remember these different brain areas. All right, so starting off with peripheral nervous system, or PNS. This is an area that connects and communicates between the central nervous system, your muscles, your organs, your glands. So it is very connected. A lot of areas in the brain are very connected. It's a big connection organ, essentially. So peripheral nervous system contains both the autonomic and somatic nervous system. Autonomic is not conscious, it's controlling the body, and we'll get to it in a little more detail in the next slides. And then somatic is getting sensory information from skin, muscles, organs, things like that. So jumping into a little more detail on the autonomic piece of the peripheral nervous system, this is control over the internal organs. So it's controlling your lungs, your heart. Like, you don't have to stop and think for your heart to beat, right? Your lungs will breathe when you're not consciously thinking about it. Like, you can obviously control your breath, but the autonomic nervous system will do that for you. It doesn't take those higher cognitive functions to run those processes. It also is involved with the smooth muscles in organs, like in your intestines and bladder, to help those organs be run correctly. Sympathetic nervous system here is doing things like increasing your heart rate. It inhibits digestion. So it's like prepping you for running away or fighting. It often is activated with stress. Then the parasympathetic is the opposite of that. It kind of does the opposite that the sympathetic does, resets and calms the body down, decreases the heart rate, increases your digestion, these kinds of things. to try and keep you at a balance. And we'll talk about that throughout this course, not just in this week. So somatic nervous system is getting senses from the environment. It's getting message and it also sends messages to skeletal muscles. So here's a picture of a bunch of different nerves. Again, knowing about them, knowing some generals, you can expect like optic, it's kind of right behind your eyes. You've got others that are in other places. The olfactory is right above your nose, right? So they are related to the things around them. You don't need to memorize them, but understand how, like its location, where it kind of developed and evolved over time, is related to its function, is a big thing with the brain. So it's both sending and receiving messages with the somatic nervous system. So here's that one over here. All right, continuing on with that idea of our bodies essentially evolved over eons to be very efficient. So the reason different brain areas are very connected to other ones that are right next to them is because, well, that was efficient. It was easy for the brain to do that, to make those small changes over time. So the brain areas right in the very middle of our brain do a lot of things, and then the things further to the outside of our brain have a little more specialization. Um, and we'll see that as we go through, but also look at the spinal cord and the nerves and what they are related to. So it makes sense for the spinal cord right here to be regulating senses and motor control of this area of your chest or this area of your core or your quads, right? It's because they are closer to it. So these structures evolved over a long period of time to be efficient and to send messages, to receive messages, also to organs in these areas, that kind of thing. And we will also talk a lot more in detail about neurons next week. So this week is all on just basic brain structures, but we'll get more into how neurons work at the cellular level next week. So afferent nerves, though, those are towards the brain or like up. So like towards more of the center of the brain, that is called afferent nerves. So light or sound coming in and towards the middle of our brain, that's afferent. And then efferent is away from the brain. So like down your arms to make your hands do things like shadow puppets or whatever you might be doing. That's an efferent nerve sending that away. With that being said, interestingly, we have evolved the capacity to use our spinal cord to do some reflexive motion. So a doctor's test where they'll tap a thing on your knee to see your reflexes, that message doesn't go all the way to the brain. It's actually, as the same time as it's getting all the way up to your brain, it has already talked to the spinal cord about here, right? It's talked to the spinal cord about to this place, and the spinal cord has sent a message already to the muscles to contract. So about the same time that you're moving it already, that your spinal cord has kind of decided. I mean, decided it's not really the right term, but the spinal cord has sent the message to move. Now you're realizing what's happening. Same thing if you touch something very hot. So that message goes in, let's say it's these fingers, it's going into the spinal cord right about here. And then the spinal cord in and of itself sends a motor sense back down to these muscles to pull your hand back. So you touch a burning stove, you pull it back. As you're already pulling it back, now you're registering, I just touched a hot stove, my hand got burned. So this is a pretty neat reflex that we evolved over time. It really only saves milliseconds to hundreds of milliseconds. So with that, that's a pretty short time, but it was evolutionarily adaptive enough that we have that capacity to jerk our hand back from the burning stove or whatever it might be. So pretty neat. All right, so continuing on, this is a really good image in your textbook. It kind of breaks off every different area of the brain. So we can see the limbic system over here, the cerebral cortex over here with a lot of specialized areas, and they're all part of the cerebrum. Right. So one thing I would recommend, especially for all these different areas, you don't have to map it out in this kind of shape, but I do recommend putting in your notes the various things that these different areas do. You could use this image or even just this slide to kind of like write notes on as you're studying or as you are reviewing or as you're here in class to put little things. So basically make your own map, your own diagram of what the different brain areas do. It's a really good study tool. It'll help you make more brain connections for these different areas because I know in the beginning the anatomy can be kind of overwhelming. This is a picture with a lot of words. There's a lot of pieces to the brain, but as you start to practice it, as you start to get into it, it'll become easier and easier. All right, so a couple other key things are in the cerebral cortex, the white and gray matter. Essentially here, you can kind of see it. The image has, this is, I mean, it's violet, depending on your monitor, I guess. It's a little more violet, and this is a little more white. Essentially, this is just a name that we gave the visual distinctions of the brain when we, as scientists, like observe them. So they are both parts of neurons or clusters. So the gray out here, or this outside edge, is actually where a lot of neuron cell bodies are. So where the like nucleus is, where there's a bunch of dendrites and things, and then most of this white matter area is actually the axons. And the reason it's white is because of the fatty myelin insulation. So again, we will get into the specifics of how a neuron is, the specifics of a neuron structure and function, but here is a little bitty preview of chapter 3. So here you've got the neuron cell body, you've got dendrites that receive a message, and that's what most of the gray matter is this part. And this is the axon, and then it can have lots of axon branches talking to lots of different neurons. They can be very long, they can be very short. The longest ones in your body are from basically the base of your brain all the way down your spine to your tailbone. So they can be up to a couple meters long in humans. And so here's another good image. You see the gray matter here. That's some of the cell bodies there. And then these are the axons or drawings of the axons. So the gray matter is the outside edge. That's the cell bodies. They need the nutrients there. That's where the waste is produced, that kind of stuff. And then the inside, the white matter, is axons. And the reason it's white is because of that myelination. The insulation around them is fatty, and so it's very white looking in appearance. And so you can think of this gray matter as kind of where the cell bodies are living, and then this is information highways going all sorts of different directions. This might be connected to just right here. Or this cell right here might also be connected here, or it might be going all the way across this corpus callosum right here, CC. So it might be going all the way across there talking to the other side of the brain. So that is the white matter piece, that's the gray matter piece. So lots of information highways in this whitish area. Oops, too far. Let's just use the arrow keys instead. So with that, there are other interior areas of your brain over here, especially in the limbic system, that have gray matter as well. So it's not just the outside edge. So these areas over here, there's a lot of gray and white matter in the cerebellum as well, but a lot of these areas in the limbic system are mostly gray matter. So a lot of those cell bodies with connections, again, going all the way out across the brain. So you can see some of their axons would be coming out like right here. So we'll get back to the neuron and what it looks like in more detail, but let's watch a couple minutes of this video to make it a little more clear what's going on at this level of the brain anatomy.
In this video, we're going to learn about the gray matter and the white matter of the nervous system. In this video, we will also learn about the different types of glial cells found in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So here we have the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Taking a cross section of the brain here, it would look something like this. So this is our brain. This outer part here, which is darker, is known as the gray matter, and the rest is the white matter. The gray matter is where we find cell bodies of neurons, dendrites, axon terminals, and unmyelinated axons. The white matter is where we find axons, but particularly myelinated axons, because it's the myelin sheath wrapping around the axon that gives the white matter its white color. If we were to differentiate the gray matter and the white matter in a physiological aspect, the gray matter is essentially where synapses occur between neurons, and is a region where integration and command initiation takes place. And this is because the gray matter consists of the cell bodies, dendrites, and axon terminals. So from this, we know that this is a region where synapses occur. The white matter, on the other hand, is where information is carried from place to place. And this is because it consists mainly of axons, myelinated axons. This is the thalamus, and the thalamus is also a gray matter region. And this is because in the thalamus, many synapses between neurons take place. This dark area here is not gray matter, rather it's the cerebellum, and this is the brainstem. So now let's compare the gray matter and
All right, so hopefully that gave you a little other explanation to make this a little more clear on what's going on there. So again, there's more areas here in the limbic system. There's more areas there in that limbic system that are involved with doing the job of sending messages, receiving messages and sending messages down an axon. All right, so that is a lot in the limbic system right here. Okay, so with this, they mentioned glial cells. I've always called them glial cells. That's what happens when you learn something by reading it and not hearing it. Sometimes you pronounce it differently. So I've always pronounced it glial cells. I've heard it pronounced glial cells. They pronounced it glial cells in that video. So whichever one is totally fine. I usually write it rather than say it. So that is how it's spelled. With that, there are a lot of other cells in the brain. We usually focus on the neurons because they're the primary cell that sends and receives messages. Again, we'll get into lots more detail on neurons next week, but there are other cells. Glial or glial cells are the red ones in this picture here. And they do a lot of things. Part of what they do is literally hold neurons where they live. So they're a scaffolding. They literally are a thing that neurons can, kind of like a vine up a fence, or like if you have a cucumber plant that you want to put up a trellis, they're kind of the trellis. They're kind of the structure that neurons can be attached to. You can see it's kind of green and viney. This green piece is the neuron. So with that, we usually focus on the neurons, but glial cells we are finding do more than we once thought. We used to think that they just were a structure that neurons kind of sat on, but then we saw, oh, they actually do bring some nutrients to neurons. They take away some waste. And even more recently, we see that there are some glial cells that do actually create neurotransmitters to then be used by the neurons. So they are a piece of the whole puzzle of the process of us doing things with our brain. And we'll talk about them again a little bit next week. Right? And this white matter and this capacity for change is really what we want to talk about when we're talking about plasticity. This is a really cool study of taxi drivers in the UK that really goes to show the difference in what people's brains do as they learn. So plasticity is the capacity that you can change, you can learn new things, you can learn a new instrument, you can learn a new language, you can learn to do something if you had brain damage in many cases. Like it depends on the extent of the damage, that kind of thing. If you have a neurodegenerative illness, but your brain is relatively plastic. It can bounce back because mainly it can grow more of these dendrites and it can grow more of these axon branches to make new connections. So a cool study was done in the UK. They looked at taxi drivers around London and they looked at people who lived in London. So just like normal Londoners and then also taxi drivers. They examined their brains with MRIs to see how dense the structures, like which structures were bigger or smaller. And they found that in the white matter and the areas of the brain that are involved in mental maps, the taxi drivers had tons more axons or tons more axon branches. Our neurons only have one axon, but they had lots more axon branches. And so that really you could see that in the brain scans. There were so many more connections that those given areas, and it's not necessarily this area in the brain, I'm just using that as an example. So you can kind of see there's some space here, but it's a lot more dense right here. So the brains of the people who were taxi drivers were much more dense than the ones who just lived in London. And that makes sense. They've got a lot of experience driving around the side streets. They need to know the maps. This was also done before we had GPS as widely around. And so it goes to show that you literally are changing your brain as you are learning new things. You are making new connections with these dendrites and axon branches in a way that you can tell when you zoom in on someone's brain structure. Pretty cool. All right, so with that, why is the brain wrinkly? If you just took off the skull, why would it look wrinkly? Your book answers this, but this is a question I'll ask in class if we get to this point in class. But really, it's because these folds allow for us to have more surface area for those neuron cell bodies, for more gray matter to fit. So I'm going to jump back to this picture again. So you can see, well, you would lose all of this if we didn't have that wrinkle there. So we see we've got a wrinkle and we've got lots more gray matter that can fit in that area. So gray matter really is only about 2 to 4 millimeters thick in most areas of the brain, and we have about 1,800 centimeters, square centimeters of that gray matter across each hemisphere. So, or the 1,800 was the whole brain. I forget. It's either one half of the brain or the whole brain. But either way, that's only about each hemisphere being about the size of a medium thin crust pizza crust. So just the pizza crust, that's about how much gray matter it is. And it does a lot. It does all these things that we're going to be talking about. Again, there are parts in the limbic system that are also gray matter. The occipital lobe is basically a little brain. It's got a lot of gray matter and a lot of white matter as well for connections. But we'll get to that. But the reason it's so folded is because it allows for us to have that many connections. So hopefully at this point, you're starting to see how some of these things are connected together, how some of the structure and anatomy of the brain lends itself to doing certain things. And hopefully those connections that you're making will help you understand as we talk about specific areas. But before we talk about more specific areas, let's try to watch this video again. If it doesn't pull up, go back to that main page, click on the link or click on this link on your own. If I get a copyright strike, I'll just cut this part out of the video the part where I try to watch this. So if it's not there, go and click on it. This second video I think is pretty useful too. Maybe it'll give you some ideas on how you could make your own mnemonics or memory tricks to try and remember some of these things.
These are some story-style mnemonics that helped me memorize a few brain parts during AP Psychology. I hope it helps you as well for whatever test or exam coming up. Broca's area. You have a talking doll. She keeps saying mama, and it gets really annoying, so you smash it and it becomes broken. The Broca's area is responsible for speech production. Those who suffer from Broca's aphasia have difficulty enunciating words despite understanding them. Just remember, Broca's area, broken doll that talks. Speech production. Parietal lobe. You're at a Halloween party, and it's the kind of party where you're touching all the weird stuff that's supposed to be brains and other body parts. You say ew. The parietal lobe is responsible for processing sensory information and interpreting visual information. Hence why you're seeing and feeling all this weird stuff, and you're interpreting it as disgusting at the Halloween party. Hypothalamus. There is a moose who is high on pot. He's really hungry and thirsty. Just think of the 4 F's. Feed, fight, flee, and mate. Or, if you want a word that starts with F, fornicate. The hypothalamus is responsible for controlling the autonomic nervous system and the aforementioned 4 F's. Cerebral cortex. You are eating a bowl of Lucky Charms cereal, and you realize there are no marshmallows. You decide to take them to cereal court. The judge there says, guilty. The cerebral cortex is responsible for higher brain functions such as thought and action, hence the judge making a decision, and cereal court sounding like cerebral cortex. Amygdala. So for the amygdala, instead of a story, we're just going to call it the Emo-dilla. It's full of emotions, aggression, and fear, which is what the amygdala is primarily responsible for. Frontal lobe. There is a little old lady trying to cut to the front of the line. First, you have an impulse to trip her, but you control yourself. The frontal lobe is responsible for a lot of skills, such as motor functions, problem solving, and impulse control. Hence, in this story, you control yourself, despite the old lady trying to cut to the front of the line. Corpus callosum. There is a giant coliseum that stands over the equator. There is a dead corpse lying over the equator in both hemispheres. The corpus callosum is responsible for connecting the left and right hemisphere. Left hemisphere. There is a foreigner in the army who is new to our language. He keeps chanting left. The left hemisphere is responsible for language and controlling the right side of the body. Hence, the foreigner being new to language and chanting left. Right hemisphere. You are at an abstract art museum. The only direction you can turn is to the right. The right hemisphere is responsible for creativity and the arts, as well as controlling the left side of the body.
So I'm going to jump in there. Not everything in these videos is accurate. The left side of the brain being responsible for language, that is accurate. It's also responsible for the right side of motion and sensation of things on the right side of your body. But the right side of your brain is not about creativity. That is a myth that people are right or left brain, more creative or more analytical. Totally false. But if it helps you remember, this kind of silly mnemonic might be useful to you. Just to be clear, though, your creativity goes mostly from the frontal cortex, but is using a lot of other areas of the brain too. So say like the amygdala, if you're creating something that you want to bring out emotion or you're putting emotion into, as an example. So it's not just your right or left side of your brain. So that being said, most of the things are accurate enough that it's relevant in these videos, but if you see something that is does not line up with your book, use the book as the source. It is the most up-to-date. The version, as of the time I'm recording this, the book is less than 6 months old, so it's a good source. All right, continuing on, we've got a couple of these other little mnemonics, but again, the main idea here is not that you have to memorize these mnemonics. It's to give you some ideas of if you want to make your own mnemonics to remember these brain areas.
Lobe. There is a kindergartner painting with purple tempera paint. He keeps painting over his ears and screaming, "I can't hear you!" The temporal lobe is mainly responsible for auditory perception, hence the kindergartner saying, "I can't hear you." Hippocampus. You are at Hippo University. There is a freshman hippo who is lost on campus. The older hippos are taunting him, saying, "Haha, you can't remember." The hippocampus is responsible for memory, particularly long-term memory. Pituitary gland. You are staring into a giant pit that keeps growing and growing and growing. When you yell down the pit, it says, "Echo." The pituitary gland is responsible for the secretion of hormones into our bloodstream, hence the emphasis on growing. Of course, there are many other areas of the brain that I haven't.
All right, so some of those were pretty silly. I still like my hippocampus one, where rather than you're on a hippo university, the hippo can remember better than the elephant. I think that works well for me, but the main idea here is figure out some memory tools and tricks that will work for you specifically. Again, you don't have to memorize all of these this first time in this hour or so of lecture or in this week, but start to get familiar with these pieces of the anatomy because we will be talking about them a lot as we go through the rest of the chapters in the book. All right, the next thing to talk about is the corpus callosum. So this is an area, you can see two images of it here. So it's an area of axons going between the two hemispheres of the brain. There are other connections than just the corpus callosum. There are other areas. So the here in the limbic region, the brainstem, the goodness, it left my brain. The cerebrum, cerebellum, One of those two. Anyway, this area also has connections across, and there are a couple other areas where it's connected across, but it is the main one. You could think of it as the main highway between the two sides of the brain. So it's being used a lot. We're using pretty much a lot of our brain for any given task that we do. We're using things on the left side and the right side, the front, the back, in the middle for a lot of the things that we do. And so a lot of those signals or axons are going through the middle of the brain, connecting to other neurons across. And that's what this is looking at. This is actually looking at axon pathways to give us a sense of how many are there. And with this, I had a pretty neat experience in that I was able to do some dissection of human brains. So these were people who had passed on and had donated their bodies to science, right? It's not like mad scientist kind of stuff here. But I was able to like take a probe and poke different areas of the brain in different sections. And one thing that was really apparent in doing that is the white matter in, say, this area, or say where it's kind of blue here, was a little bit squishy, right? It could kind of give and push. It was a little less dense. But when poking at the corpus callosum, basically at this exact angle that we're looking at right here, poking at it, it was hard. There were so many axons, so much myelination there that it was hard because of how many connections are between the brain, which I thought was pretty cool. So I know I don't have brains for you to handle, but hopefully that will give you a sense of how different that part of the brain is than some of the other areas of the brain. Yeah, essentially that is a connection between the sides of our brain. So the frontal lobe is the next one that we'll talk about, and it is right behind your forehead. It covers a pretty large area of your gray matter right here on your head. So it goes to a little bit behind my receding hairline, if you can see in the video right there. It's a little bit past the middle right there. But it is involved in a lot of what we consider higher order functions of humans. So this is things like planning, voluntary movement, choosing to do something. So am I going to go off that snowboard jump or not? Also reasoning, problem solving, a lot of that is happening here in this frontal lobe. And there are subsections here in the frontal lobe. There's the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of the very frontmost area, and that's where a lot of the problem solving and reasoning is happening. But they are all integrated. There's a lot of integration in the brain. There's also the precentral gyrus over here that does the motor functions, and I'll show that in a minute in a little more detail. Then Broca's area about here, where we produce language. And it's got a lot of connections with Wernicke's area over here, or Wernicke's area. That is over here for understanding language here in the temporal lobe. But there, the frontal lobe, we consider that like the most advanced part of the human brain because it's kind of the most recently evolved. It's a little bigger in us humans than other similar mammals. So kind of the brainstem and occipital lobe and some of the central structures and then some of the cerebral cortex, and then the frontal lobe evolved last. So it's kind of in that order from down here to kind of the center, and then over here, then up to here. So with that being said, the motor cortex is here in the really near the very back of that frontal lobe, and it directs the movement of body parts. So if you want to say reach out and grab a Lego or a coffee cup or whatever it might be, you are using basically this part of the gray matter. And this kind of creepy looking picture really just kind of indicates how much area is dedicated to different body parts. So you've got a lot for the face, the lips, the tongue, swallowing, talking, kissing, right? Those kind of muscles and neurons are sending the signal to do those actions. You've also got a lot for the hands. You've got a lot of dexterity in your hands, a lot of neurons dedicated to that. Compare the area that is responsible for doing motions with your hands to the area for your trunk and hips and knee. So there's not very much area there. You can get a lot more specific with the dexterity in your hands, partially because of how much gray matter is dedicated to that part of your body. That being said, you can also look down here at what's involved for the foot and toes. You might have seen people who maybe don't have use of their hands. Maybe they weren't born with hands, they lost them early on in an accident, something like that, and they've learned to, say, play piano with their feet. So that's one example of plasticity. This area of the brain can take over that function. This area might grow a little bit bigger or it might have more axons, more connections, more density here to do some of those functions. So that is another example of that plasticity. But yeah, right behind that motor cortex in the frontal lobe is the next lobe back, and that is the parietal lobe. So that's this area back here, and it does a lot of integration. There's a lot of touch sensations, body and spatial maps. It's integrating a bunch of senses from our body, our eyes, things like that, and it puts them together. But one area I really want to focus on is basically right behind the motor cortex. So there's a division there called the central sulcus, but right behind the motor cortex is the somatosensory cortex. So, and I might actually have the wrong picture here. This might be the motor cortex picture, but the somatosensory cortex is kind of doing the same thing. So the somatosensory cortex, I'm going to click back and forth. Yeah, I might have mixed up these pictures actually, but that's okay because the main idea is that you have a lot more gray matter dedicated to feeling in your hands and your face as well. So again, that's things like touch, it's things like feeling a kiss, it's things like knowing that you have the cup in the right spot on your mouth, as well as feeling the temperature, the heat of your coffee mug. That kind of thing is happening in the somatosensory cortex. So that's the main idea. Even though I do think looking at it, I think I swapped these pictures between them. I think this is actually the motor cortex. The other one was somatosensory cortex, but they're right next to each other. They're right on the other side. Then there's a lot of connections between them. So you can feel pain, pressure, itch with your skin, and then you can then move. You can intentionally move, grab another coffee cup, grab a Lego, whatever it might be. So this is also one of the reasons the somatosensory cortex having so much space dedicated to hands, mouth, tongue, and hands is one of the reasons why babies like to grab things and put them in their mouth. Those areas of their brain are much more sensitive to those body sensations, and so that is why you should keep things like Legos away from babies and give them safer toys like that they can't swallow and choke on, because they will often use their mouth as a way to explore an object. So continuing on, the temporal lobe is this one right here. It kind of wraps around your brain. It's right behind your temples. And this is where we do a lot of auditory processing, not just language, but Wernicke's area does process and help us understand language. Again, it talks to Broca's area to create language. But yeah, this is where we are also recognizing visual objects. It does seem like there is some storage of memory here as well. We've seen in rats that they seem to have some specific areas that are place detectors, so they can recognize the place that they are. So humans might have that as well. It's a little unclear, but we do know that there's some activity there for some certain memories. So what do you see when I put this up? You probably see some faces. Most humans have really good what's called feature detectors, and our temporal lobe, basically right in the bottom underneath that temporal lobe, is feature detectors where we detect faces really well. So we've been developing that skill ever since we were very tiny babies, and we are very good at picking up faces, even though this is really a paper towel dispenser, this is a cheese grater, this is some kind of access point in the street, and this is a backpack. But you probably looked at it and saw faces because those cells are very much attuned to the shapes and patterns of faces. This is also one of the reasons that we have like the uncanny valley when you see something CG that's not quite right. It's like, that looks like a face, but it's not quite right. What's going on here? That's part of what's happening there too. It's processing it as face, but then it's like, oh, but it's not. Because we've had a lot of experience. We've got a lot of neurons to detect that. We also might have some of those detectors for places and recognizing places there in the temporal lobe as well. So the next thing that we'll go over is this little video on using the hand as a model of the brain. And I will speed it up a little bit. Again, if it doesn't work, go and click on it on your own as well.
Show you how, and all you need are your hands. Stretch out your hands in front of you. See how the skin on this side of your hands is darker than on the other side? That's just like the outer layer of the brain, called the cortex, or the gray matter. The outside of the brain is darker than the inside because it's lined with neuron cell bodies. Cell bodies are also called soma. Cell bodies keep the neuron healthy and functioning. The muscles inside your hands represent the white matter of your brain. White matter is made up of neuron axons. Axons carry information from one neuron to another, but it's important to remember that two neurons never really touch. If you make a fist with your hands, you can form a shape that's similar to your brain's. This is how human brains are able to squeeze so much gray matter cortex into the small space within your skull. Now take your hands, cross your wrists, and make the back of your hands touch each other. This will help you remember that the left hemisphere of your brain controls the right side of your body, while the right hemisphere of your brain controls the left side of your body. Look closer at your hands. The area where they touch represents the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a bundle of nerves that connect the two hemispheres of the brain and help them to communicate with each other. I like to think of it as the Golden Gate Bridge of the brain. Your wrists represent the brainstem. The brainstem sits at the very bottom of your brain. It's the most basic part of your brain and regulates important life functions like breathing, your heart rate, sleeping, eating, and more. This is also where signals from the right side of your body cross over to the left brain and where signals from the left side of your body cross over to your right brain. Your arms represent the spinal cord. The spinal cord extends down your back. It sends and receives information from the rest of your body. Let's focus on the left hemisphere. Your front fingers represent your frontal lobe. If you remember front fingers, frontal lobe, you'll be able to remember that this is the part of your brain responsible for complex and abstract thought. It sits right behind your forehead, and it's the most advanced part of your brain. The frontal lobe helps you to make plans, imagine possible futures, and helps you to control your emotions. It doesn't finish developing until your mid-20s, which is why a lot of kids and teenagers can sometimes do impulsive things. If you extend your index and middle finger, you'll see the part of your hand that represents the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe integrates all the sensory information in your body. Your sense of space, navigation, and touch all get relayed here. But your brain doesn't prioritize each part of your body equally. Take a look at this homunculus map of the primary motor cortex of the brain. You'll notice that the brain prioritizes information from your hands and face. Now look at the back of your hands. You'll notice they look like eyes. This will help you to remember the occipital lobe, the area responsible for your visual information, and how it's located in the back of your brain. Have you ever hit the back of your head and seen stars? It's because you hit your occipital lobe. Take a look at your thumb. See how it can lift away from the rest of your fist, but remain attached to your hand? That's similar to the temporal lobe. The back of the temporal lobe is connected to the parietal and occipital lobes, but the front section can be lifted away from the rest of the brain. The temporal lobe is responsible for understanding sounds and speech. Here's how I remember this. The thumb looks like a temporal lobe, which is important for talking. If we take a closer look at the temporal lobe, we'll find the limbic system. The limbic system is responsible for emotions, learning, and memory. Inside, you'll find the amygdala, an almond-shaped structure, which is located just below where your thumbnail is. The amygdala is responsible for basic emotions. Further inside your thumb is the hippocampus. It's sort of where the bone is in this part of your thumb. The hippocampus is responsible for learning and memory. That's it. Now you've got a portable model of the brain that you can take with you and use whenever you need it. Recreate it with your own hands a few times and customize your model by making your own mnemonics. What questions do you have about the brain?
All right, so really good example of using your hands as a model of your brain. Again, any one of these videos might be really helpful for you or might not. The main idea is to use some of these other ways to connect this information, whether it be songs, whether it be your hands, or whether it be repeating it a lot to try and remember these different parts of your brain. All right, next one we will talk about is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is at the back of your brain, so basically right here at the very back, not quite down here, this is cerebellum, but right up here is the occipital lobe, and that is where the messages come from your eyes. So this is your visual cortex, your processing visual input. There are specific regions in the occipital lobe for specific things. It's looking just like we were talking earlier in the temporal lobe about face detectors. There are also specific regions that look for colors, orientations, edges, textures, things like that. So in this area of the brain, there are messages kind of going back and forth through here, as well as up to the motor cortex. There's connections there, but there's not just a strict, it goes in this path. It kind of bounces around in the occipital lobe to give us a sense of what is going on. And with that signal going up and down through the visual hierarchy, it gives us a determination of what we are looking at and where things are in our surrounding environment. That's really important if you're like moving through a room, moving through a forest, also knowing where you are within relation to the things around you. If you're trying to catch a ball, where and what that is. It's also really important for hand-eye coordination too. So if I want to pick up my coffee cup, I need to know what it is and where it is, and I need to be able to also use the frontal lobe to be able to use that motor cortex to help determine where things are. It's also going to be bringing in this lobe that we'll talk about a little bit later for making those fine movements with hand-eye coordination. Next is the insula. So this is an area that's kind of folded in. It's a lot of gray matter close to the middle of the brain, kind of under the frontal lobe and under the temporal lobe. You can kind of see here's some of the frontal lobe right there. Here's the temporal lobe kind of folded in on that. And this green part, this area, is a bunch of gray matter that's got connections all over the brain. So why do we know so little about it? Well, think about it for a second, where it is, why that might be. It's pretty much just about this big. It kind of extends just a little bit past there, but it is just kind of a little sliver of gray matter there closer to the middle of your brain. So we really know very little about this area, mostly because of where it's located. Most of the methods that we use to measure the brain are detecting things from the outside with EEGs, or they're looking at MRIs, and then we have to look through a bunch of different structures. So the insula is surrounded by so many other structures, it kind of makes it difficult to get a sense of exactly what the insula is doing versus what the other areas are doing around it. So that is one of the main reasons that we have such a hard time figuring out. So it is one of the least understood areas in the brain, but it does seem to be involved in a lot of different things. And this should hopefully start making sense to you because it's connected, or it's close to, a bunch of different things. It's related to sensory processing, taste, body sensations, states of things like pain, arousal, emotions, motor control, self-awareness, empathy, risk prediction, consciousness. So it's involved in a whole bunch of things. And going back to the previous slides, it's not that big. It's really this green area here. You see some of its white matter in relation to the green is really its gray matter right there. Here's another view of it right there. So it's not a very big area, but in here you've got things like the amygdala for emotions. Over here, you've got the motor and sensory cortex. So it's kind of right next to a bunch of other areas. So a lot of messages passing through here. It's part of the networks for a lot of different things. So that in and of itself kind of does make it hard to determine exactly what it's doing because it's doing so many things. But it's a bunch of gray matter that sends a lot of messages around, and so it's part of a bunch of different brain processes. So it's a pretty neat little area of the brain. So why is it associated with all those things? I basically just answered that question because here I'm not actually asking that to you like Dora the Explorer, but basically it's because it's next to both the limbic system, the temporal cortex, the frontal lobes with the motor cortex. So it's part of a lot of those processes. It's a piece of that chain of neurons activating these different things that we're experiencing and deciding to do. So the next one I wanted to show you is a song about structure and function of the brain. So these last couple in the slides are still useful, especially if it helps you remember the things. But I think the ones that I've shown so far are probably the most useful. So if you feel like you've got a good sense of it, feel free to kind of skip this portion. But if you want to get another sense of another song, another kind of way to remember these things, it is a pretty good one.
The brain's divided into three parts: forebrain, midbrain, and hypothalamus. Sensory switchboard regulates the sleep and wake. Limbic system regulates fear, drives emotions. Hippocampus, amygdala, hypothalamus. Hippocampus memory, long-term memory events. Hypothalamus releasing hormones, endocrine system. Amygdala motion linked to the fear response. Aggressive behavior, anxiety, motivation. Midbrain reticular formation, arousal regulating, medulla breathing, heartbeat, pulsatile respiration, and also face sensations like cardiovascular functions. And then for your balance, equilibrium, this part the cerebellum, visual imbalance, attention, control, and motor movements, and your cognitive functions like language and attention. Intricate organ, we hardly understand, controls all our decisions and cognitive functions. And it's got these four lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. parts control. Cerebrum's made of two hemispheres. Outer cerebral cortex for control neuron layer, for control of all processes. And it's made up of glial cells that nourish, supporting and protecting all of our neurons. Here's the parietal lobe, somatosensory cortex, baxi-occipital lobe for visual perception, temporal lobe, energies, written language, frontal lobe, Broca's speech comprehension. And the basal ganglia helps with routine behaviors. The olfactory bulb determine how we can smell flavors. Association areas for higher mental behaviors. The prefrontal cortex up in the front end, executive management. Primary motor cortex regulates movements like walking. 3 pounds controls our senses and all our experiences. Intricate organ, we hardly understand. Controls all our decisions and cognitive functions. And it's got these 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, all different parts control.
Well, I know I just said you could skip that one. It does repeat some of the areas is the main reason, but it's definitely a better song than some of the other ones. So hopefully you didn't, or hopefully it was useful for you. But yeah, that's the idea, is to use these songs, use these mnemonics, use these memory tricks, like the idea of using the hands as a brain model to help remember these different things. It's a lot of anatomy that we're going over. We've gone over so many different brain areas, and there's a couple more that we're going to get to. We're not going to touch on every single one, but now we're going to jump a little bit more into depth in the limbic system. And I've alluded to it a couple times in the lecture so far, but it's kind of in the very center of your brain. So if you kind of had an MRI machine looking right at the middle, you would see limbic system structures. And there's a lot of structures here that are kind of weird shapes. So the other areas of the brain evolved later, and our evolution kind of figured out like this is how to make brain parts, and so it kind of added on those similar kind of parts. But on top of the brainstem, we've got the cerebellum and then the limbic system. And they're all kind of differently shaped because they evolved at different times for different things. So we've got here in the whole limbic system, which there's some different parts pointed out in these couple images right there. The limbic system as a whole does a lot of things with memory, emotion, behavior, motivation, smelling things. It's also involved in making communications and connections across the brain. And so because it's in the middle, these parts for memory, emotion, motivation, hormones connecting to the hypothalamus and, oh, here we go, and the pituitary gland, and registering hormones in the blood. It's a central location that is connected to so many different things that we do with our brains. So with that being said, another thing that I'll bring up is whether it's in one of these songs, whether it's in another book or website, scientists like to argue about the definitions of things. I do this in heroism. So there's some scientists who say heroism is X, Y, and Z, and I say, no, it's just X and Y. So we like to do this. But because of that, you might see some things that are included or not included, depending on the book and the year and of the paper that you're reading. So probably at the time that it was published, it was correct, but sometimes we kind of kick things out from being part of the limbic system. Kind of like we kicked out Pluto from being a planet. It's messed up, huh? So with that being said, let's continue on and talk about the hippocampus in the limbic system. So again, the hippocampus, I think of it as hippo for memory. The hippo's actually got a good memory. Elephants have a bad memory, but it was actually named after a sea monster, kind of a sea monster that kind of looked like a seahorse. And it does. It definitely looks a lot more like a seahorse than it does a hippo. But the idea there for my connection, hopefully it helps me remember it. So it is a bunch of gray matter connected to a lot of other things in the brain. And the main job that it does is kind of direct memory storage. So as you are experiencing something, the hippocampus will then say, hey, make that into a memory. Make that network that is currently active, turn that into a memory. So it's kind of the creator of the memories, or it helps write those memories or make those connections stronger to become that memory. So most memories don't seem to be stored here. Rats do seem to have some place recognition here in their brain, but it's not clear if that's the case for humans as well. Maybe, probably, but it's definitely part of that direction of, hey, make that neural network a memory. And we'll talk a lot more about memory in a later chapter. I can't remember what week it is as of right now, but check your schedule. But with that, the basics of memory is, yeah, we run some signals through the hippocampus as we are experiencing something, but maybe we're also using the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe. Maybe we are using the amygdala for emotions at the same time. So those neurons that are active during something happening, the hippocampus will say, hey, make those stronger connections. Essentially, it keeps kind of repeating the signal, and the neurons that are the most active during that event, and we'll talk about that. Again, neurons have slightly less active, slightly more active cycles. The ones that are the very most active will become the memory. So your memory is literally some of the neurons that were active during the event that happened. And the hippocampus directs, hey, write that into the memory. So it's not quite like Inside Out where you've got a nice little memory ball that you can kind of replay, but it does work really well for us. All right, so jumping to the amygdala, this is kind of an exploded view of the limbic system, and then has it connected. So we've got the hippocampus that we were just looking at, and then right here, the amygdala in this kind of green color. And it's, again, mostly gray matter here in the middle of the brain. A lot of what it does is integration of connections between brain areas. So anything that's going on, your amygdala is probably involved. If you are consciously aware and experiencing things, your amygdala is probably active in part of these processes. So with that, it connects prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, brainstem, your senses. And one of the big things is that it does is emotional responses. So it can actually also activate the sympathetic nervous system. So it, with the hypothalamus, it can work together. And let's see where the hypothalamus is here. It might actually be in this image. You know, we've got the hippocampus, but we don't have the at least it's not pointed out. But it, along with the hypothalamus, the pituitary glands kind of growing off the hypothalamus. So it works with that to read the hormones in your blood and also excrete hormones into your body. And also some of your brain uses those hormones. Some hormones are also neurotransmitters. Some are just hormones for the use of organs in your body. But yeah, the amygdala does a lot of emotion and emotional responses. So that's why things like memory are very closely tied to, say, emotions. If you think of your grandmother's house, maybe it's a very happy memory, or maybe it's a very sad memory, right? And part of that is because that amygdala is part of that memory network. The hippocampus helps tell the amygdala to be part of that memory, but the amygdala, in all that we do, is, well, pretty much all that we do is part of the puzzle of the connections all throughout our brain. All right, the next one is basal ganglia. Again, mostly gray matter. It is a weirdly shaped structure compared to, say, the outside wrinkly portion of the brain. And another thing that it does is help us coordinate those voluntary movements. So we have the primary motor cortex. We've talked about the occipital lobe. We're going to talk about the cerebellum, but also the basal ganglia helps us coordinate voluntary movements. It's also a big part of habitual behaviors. So if, for example, a minute ago, my phone is currently recording what I'm saying, as one, a backup, and it's to transcribe what I'm saying. But a minute ago, I heard a notification from my phone. My urge, or what I did, my movement, my habitual behavior was to check my pocket for my phone. So that was happening from the basal ganglia. So I have a pattern of behavior to just check my phone or check my pocket for my phone. So damage to this area really does oftentimes involve movement disorders. So you might have jerking of limbs with damage to this area, that kind of thing. Right, so that's the basal ganglia. You're still in the limbic system. Another piece is the thalamus. So the thalamus is another, again, a big relay station, a hub. It's basically right in the very middle, like a lot of these structures are right around the middle, but this one's like right at the very middle of your brain. And so it's getting senses from the cerebral cortex, it's going through the thalamus. Basically, everything except smell goes through here. So your sense of smell goes on its own pathway, but sight, hearing, touch, it goes through the thalamus. So it's part of the puzzle in memory, attention, motor control, your decision making. So it is one of those key pieces. And you can see up here in this image, this is the corpus callosum right there. And then here is the thalamus, here's the hypothalamus. The amygdala is pretty hard to see in this image of an actual brain, but they're all kind of right there. And so the thalamus being right there in the middle is integrating information from all over your body. So again, it's one of those structures that's being used in most of the processing that your brain is doing. So jumping to the hypothalamus, we've talked about it a couple times. So it is here and it's connected, or the pituitary gland is kind of growing out of it. And so essentially, this is controlling endocrine hormones in our blood. So endocrine hormones do a lot of things in our bodies. They control mood, growth. So like growth hormone is one of the endocrine hormones. Reproduction. So with that, sex drive, for example, and the body and brain use these hormones. So again, some of these hormones are also neurotransmitters. A lot of them are created here because of the hypothalamus in the pituitary gland. It also helps regulate and monitor drives and motivation. So whether that be things like hunger or desire for sex, these kinds of things. It's often called a pleasure center of the brain, and that's correct, but it's also not the only pleasure center of the brain. A lot of the other areas that we've already talked about also do some of that processing of things that we find pleasurable. So, but it's often talked about as a pleasure center of the brain. If you're interested in hormones more specifically, this is a good medical website that talks about the different glands in your body, like the pituitary gland, that talks about what different hormones are created at each one and what each of those hormones do. So here at the pituitary gland, we've got growth hormone, a couple that I can't say, and prolactin, all sorts of hormones. I think total of 7 or 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. So, yep, that is the hypothalamus in the limbic system. Next is the cerebellum, and this name came from little brain. And if you look at it down here, it really does look like a little brain. It's got its own very dense folds. It's got white matter inside. It's got gray matter on the outside. And right here, one of its main things is coordinated movement, helping us have good posture. So it, with the motor cortex and some of those relay stations, help us do things like balance on a snowboard to be able to then choose to take a jump or not to take a jump. So it's not initiating commands, but it's helping make that process more fine-tuned, make it so that we do have that fine or gross motor control that we wouldn't otherwise have if, say, there was damage. But not only that, the cerebellum is really interesting because it's also part of language, so speaking and using those muscles, also involved in attention, also involved in our cognition. So it's the more we're learning about it, the more we see that, oh, it's connected to a lot more than we used to think. And this isn't too surprising when we learned that it contains about 80% of the neurons in our bodies. So the 80% of the neurons are in this little brain, the cerebellum, right back here. And essentially, these are smaller neurons. They're smaller, their axons are smaller, and they're all packed in this little area. And also, it seems like there are individual divisions, kind of like we've got divisions of these 4 lobes. There are divisions here in the cerebellum, too, for specific different things, which I think is pretty neat. So, a really useful part of our brain. That is used in a lot of different processes. Again, it is one of the older ones to have evolved before some of these other structures like the frontal lobes. So it's been part of our evolutionary brain for a long period of time. So it's involved in a lot more than we used to think that it was. All right, the last couple things I want to get into is a little bit on cerebrospinal fluid and a little bit on the brain or the blood system to the brain. So cerebrospinal fluid, you could think of it as the cushioning for the brain, but it also does help circulate nutrients. So there are areas all around, basically all the blue. You can imagine the blue is all cerebrospinal fluid, and here in the midst of the brain, there's also cerebrospinal fluid, but as well as those areas, there are also ventricles, so chordate plexus all around, creating that cerebrospinal fluid. So there in the midst of the brain, there are some cavities that are full of this cerebrospinal fluid here all around the edges and kind of in between the crevices of the brain. There's some cerebrospinal fluid. And the brain is essentially floating in it. So if the brain wasn't floating in the cerebrospinal fluid, if you weren't making enough of it, essentially the brain would squish off its own blood supply because it's heavy enough that it would squish its own blood supply. So it's really good that we have it. It's also one thing that enables us to take some like shock to our skull. So our skull it's a hard bone, right? But also that fluid really helps with the shock impact. That being said, it is with the kinds of forces that we take when, say, playing football or a car accident or a motorcycle accident, it's really easy to overload the capacity of the cerebrospinal fluid to cushion our brain. And so we'll talk about things like traumatic brain injury. That's one way that this can happen, is from things like concussions, actually damaging the brain. It's also, unfortunately, one of the reasons that Batman can't really exist. You can't go out at night, even with your really advanced helmet that looks like a bat, which is really cool. You can't be getting punched in the head or shot in the head a bunch of times and still have your full cognitive capacity because you're still limited to what these neurons can take. And they're pretty delicate little instruments. And so if you're getting that much damage, it's going to lead to problems. So unfortunately, that's why Batman and human superheroes couldn't exist. Superman's probably fine because there's some other thing, right? It's got like an aura of protection around him. So Superman's probably fine. Batman, not so much, unfortunately. Helmets can diminish that, so they make the shock happen over a wider area. They have cushioning, so it's another layer of cushion. So definitely, if you ride a motorcycle, wear your helmet. I was in a bad motorcycle accident, and without my helmet, I would not be having this conversation right now. I would be dead, essentially. Also, yeah, I've still got that helmet. It's got some nice little dents in it where I hit the pavement, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as we talk about recovery from things as well. I went through physical therapy for my knee, and but that'll come up later. The main idea here is the cerebral spinal fluid. All right, so cerebrospinal fluid is a very useful substance, but in addition to that, we've got a lot of blood vessels in our brains. So this is a cast or a model of the blood vessels in your brain. We've got 4 arteries to feed the brain, and essentially what blood does throughout your whole body is bring oxygen, sugar, materials like iron, other things to rebuild and repair damage. So when you have, say, a bone or a torn ligament in your knee, for example, going back to that motorcycle accident, you've got to have blood to come and replace some of those substances. So the injuries that I had on the side that had more blood flow, we didn't have to do surgery on. There was other injuries that didn't have as much blood flow. We had to do surgeries on those sides. So with that, it's really interesting. The brain is only about 2% of our body mass, about 3 pounds or so, but it uses 20% of our energy. And most of that energy, so about 50% or so, is just having the brain ready to fire. So not processing something really intensely, but being ready to do something, whether it's something jumping out at us, whether we need to change and do something new. The brain is kind of always using energy to be ready to fire. And we'll talk about that and how neurons actually transmit messages, but we'll come back to this. So 2% of your body mass, but using 20% of your energy. The brain is a very hungry organ for resources. And this is why some of the things some of the reason that we evolved this way to have structures close to each other, talking to each other more often, as well as how neurons, why they do some of the things that they do, why memories are made some of the ways that they are, to make sure that we are using that massive amount of energy really efficiently. So hopefully you have a lot more understanding of the brain and the structures in your brain. Again, it took hundreds of years to discover all these areas of your brain. I don't expect you to have it all memorized right now after we've watched it. We've watched some videos and things like that, but you don't have to have it completely memorized. I would recommend you reread the chapter, maybe reread your notes as well. But the main thing is going forward in class, I do want you to be familiar enough with some of these areas that you don't have to check back in your notes in, say, 3 weeks when we're mentioning that this area is part of something that could happen if you receive trauma in this area. All right, so that's what I want. I want you to start to get familiar. If you don't have it all down right now, totally fine, but do review, do start to learn these areas of your brain. And as a last thing for this lecture, I've got one more song for you at the end.
This is a song about parts of the brain. I'm singing it to memorize the names. The ideas here may be simplistic, but matching meaning and rhyme is a tough logistic. The cerebral cortex has 4 main lobes, with names from the nearby skull bones. Frontal does the thinking, occipital deals with vision, parietal senses objects, and temporal listens. Inside these lobes there's specialties, like Broca's area, which produces speech. Wernicke's area handles language comprehension, and the motor cortex is for moving with intention. Sensory cortex handles perception of touch, pain, temperature, and proprioception. There's 2 outer brain parts that are distinct. They seem separate, but everything is linked. The cerebellum does balance and coordination, and it has our memorized movement archive. The brainstem sets heartbeat and respiration and other things we need to survive. The brain's inner parts are unique. Cut the corpus callosum to take a peek. The thalamus handles signal routing, and the amygdala's emotions can have you shouting. The hippocampus does our long-term memory saving, and the hypothalamus makes our sex and food cravings. The anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex learns from mistakes, and in controlling movement, the basal ganglia is the brakes. The brain parts list is much longer indeed, but for my class assignment, this is all I need.
All right, so hopefully you enjoyed some of those songs or mnemonics as we went through the class today. And a big part of this was making new connections in your brain about the parts of the brain. But again, review this, get familiar with them. It is the basis of a lot of the things we'll talk about in this class. And next week we will jump into, depending on how I've recorded this, either next week we'll talk about neurons or we have already talked about neurons. I'm considering, after having recorded this, that maybe I will swap the order in future quarters. So that might be the case. Always double check your schedule to make sure what chapter we are going on to in the next week.